Hi, welcome to TuckerAllen Facebook Live, where we'll be discussing caregiver agreements today. My name's Missy Manning, and I'm an attorney, and I'll be filling in for our usual moderator, Scott Trout. Before we begin, I just want to give you the usual disclaimer. An attorney-client relationship is not formed by just watching this Facebook Live video. We encourage you to contact our office to get any real legal advice for you. So today I'm joined by Teresa Yao, and again, we're going to be talking about caregiver agreements. So Teresa, what exactly are caregiver agreements?
Well, thanks for having me, Missy. So caregiver agreements are essentially legal contracts that you can create with family members who are providing care to you, or that if you're the family caregiver, you can set up a contract with the person that you're taking care of in order for your caregiving services to be compensated.
Okay. So why do people use caregiver agreements then?
So yeah, that's a really good question. So the main purpose in our work when we've created it for our clients is to use them essentially as a way to kind of funnel some of those assets that the person being taken care of, they want to preserve for their kids, right? Instead of having to pay everything towards long-term care. If they don't have a professional agency that's helping them and mainly their care is just being given by their kids, this is a way for them to compensate their kids for these services and simultaneously serve as almost like a spend down in order to qualify for Medicaid down the road.
Okay, so it's all related to Medicaid planning and reducing how much the government would take of their assets.
Yeah, so in our kind of work, that's kind of essentially how we use it, because I think of caregiver agreements as this form of spend down when we don't have 5 years left. So 5 years is that kind of like special timeline where if you have 5 years left, there's a lot more different strategies for you to protect your assets before you need to get onto long-term care. But if you don't have that 5-year time limit, you don't have that 5-year window to work with, then we normally bring in caregiver agreements so that your kids can be compensated for the services that they provide to you and your assets. You can pay them, and it's a compensated transfer because they're being paid for their services, so Medicaid won't really see that as a penalty.
Okay, so it's like you don't have 5 years, but we're doing what we can.
Yeah.
So what are the requirements to set up a caregiver agreement? Can I just go online and print off a form that I find anywhere?
So there are some free forms out there, but I would caution against that. Be really careful, because anytime you're working with Medicaid, they're very particular about kind of whatever strategies that they know that some people utilize. So you want to make sure whatever is in your caregiver agreement has detailed provisions and provisions that Medicaid would look for to make sure that it actually qualifies for a compensated transfer, to make sure that the setup that you create actually doesn't incur a penalty. So yes, there are those free forms out there, but you really want to be careful about that. And then as for other requirements for this agreement, since it's a legal contract, it has to be in writing. A lot of times it's like, well, this is my daughter taking care of me, and you might think that it's okay to not have it written down in Word, but if you really want to enjoy the advantages of asset protection, you need it to be in writing. It's a contract, and you need to be specific about what level of care that your child will be providing to you. And I think an important caveat with caregiver agreements is that these contracts are essentially contracts to set up for being paid for care that's provided in the future. A lot of people are like, well, I've been providing care for them for like a year or so already. Can I get paid back for that? Unfortunately, no, which is why it's important to set up these agreements earlier than later.
Okay, how much would I get paid if I was helping out my parents, for example?
Yeah, so the compensation is kind of this gray area, but technically it just has to be reasonable. And what reasonable means is that the benchmark for it is what a third party is paid for providing that similar level of care in your geographic area. So in the St. Louis area, if your parent is just kind of needing more assisted level care, like maybe with cleaning, with cooking, normally we use numbers like $15 an hour, $16 an hour, and then, but if it's more with medical assistance services, like if you need to help administer some medication for them, or like bathing, grooming, like nursing level care at home, then the fee can be higher. So you can go up to like $25 an hour.
Okay, so that sounds like quite a bit of money over the course of a year, if you're working part or even full-time. So that's a nice way to squirrel away some money.
Absolutely.
So what are some other things that have to be included in the caregiver agreement? I know that since it's a legal contract, there's probably a lot of things that specifically have to be in there. And what are those?
Yeah, so thanks for asking that. I mean, when I said it has to be writing and it only covers care in the future, that's our kind of like the basic framework that we're working with. But like any contract, we want the date that the care begins. So you want to say, okay, starting this day is when we are going to start being paid for the services that we give to mom or dad. And then we also want to kind of give a as detailed description of services as possible, kind of saying, oh, does transportation count? Does doing errands count? Grooming. That's kind of where we lay out the framework for the services that are actually being provided to justify the fees that kind of coordinate with those services. So if it's like cooking and cleaning, then the fee will correspond accordingly to that. So we want to be detailed description of the services being provided. And we also want to make sure we kind of lay out how often the services are going to be provided. And you want to leave some flexibility in here. You can say no less than 20 hours a week or up to 80 hours a month. That just kind of gives you, gives some parameters, but gives you that flexibility to work with that depending on, different schedule changes. And you also want to detail how much the caregiver has been compensated, which we've been talking about, and also when they've been compensated. Are they paid on a monthly basis? Are they paid on a bi-weekly basis? And you also want to detail out how long the agreement is actually in effect. Do you want to only have this caregiver agreement valid for the next couple of years? Or do you want to say, hey, over the lifetime of the person being taken care of?
I wasn't really avoiding it, but I'm pretty good at procrastinating. I needed a trust. When I found TuckerAllen, all our questions were answered, all of our fears allayed.
You want your wishes in place, so there's no guessing, no stress on the children.
Basically, they talk about what you need, what's important to you. It was more conversational, really very simple.
And then the last thing you also want to include is that if there's any modifications to the contract, it has to be a mutual agreement between both parties that are signing. And obviously signing of the parties, you want to make sure the parties actually sign the contract and the date that they sign the date of the agreement.
So what about if my dad no longer has capacity to sign a caregiver agreement? Can we still set one up for him? Is that possible?
So if your dad has a power of attorney, that power of attorney can sign off for that person.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
And then what about, I've got 2 siblings and my dad, let's say he needs quite a bit of care. Could we all do a caregiver agreement or, oh, we can't, okay. Can we cover like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, like the entire time or?
So, yes, so the first part, yes. So if multiple children kind of step in and out to take care of dad, just make sure that all the parties involved in the contract are signing in an agreement of the contract and it's detailed out, hey, child 1 is providing this stuff, this type of care, child 2 is providing this type of care, and the different compensation or maybe similar compensation for structure for each child. As to, what was the second half of the question you just said?
So could we do it like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year to get the maximum amount?
So unfortunately, that's frowned upon. You can't really do 24/7 for a caregiver agreement, just because they really want to see the services that you're being compensated for are actual services you're actively taking part in taking care of that person. So for example, if they're sleeping 8 hours a day from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m., those you can't really log as caregiver services because you're kind of just sleeping along with them. So
okay, that makes sense. That's fair.
Mm-hmm.
All right. how do we go about making certain that everything's like written down and recorded and reimbursed properly? Like, what do I need to do to make it all nice and legal?
Yeah, so that's a really important question to ask, because with caregiver agreements, yes, you detail out what they need to do, but then you also want to include a caregiver log that works in conjunction with the caregiver agreement. On this caregiver log, you just want to make sure that the caregiver provides a really detailed but concise log of all the different services, like 12/11/2020. Today, I worked 2 hours, and these are the services I did in these 2 hours, so that later on, when you apply for Medicaid, it'll be really clear kind of exactly what services you're being compensated for. So there's no question that any of the money given was open to penalty.
Okay, so it's really like a real job. Like you have your time card and you write down what you do. And okay, so it really is like a real legit thing to do.
Yeah.
What about spend down? How do caregiver agreements work with spend down?
So when I think of spend down, I just think about if you're applying to Medicaid and you have excess assets, and then we kind of have talked about this in past Facebook Lives and town halls, but like in terms of excess assets with Medicaid, if you have over a certain amount of countable assets, then you can't be eligible, right? And then so what do you do with all these extra assets? There's a lot of different ways of spending down that excess. And then so caregiver agreement is a manner of that, by saying, okay, what are ways that I can smartly spend away my assets in a way that's just not just like throwing it into a hole, right? So in a caregiver agreement, you're saying, okay, yes, because normally people want to protect their assets so that their kids, their grandkids, the wealth is transferred across the generations. And then so caregiver agreements are a method of using spend down to achieve that aim, because you're essentially saying, hey, let me spend my assets and pay my kids as a way of spend down, so that you're protecting your assets concurrently with also spending down.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. What about rental agreements? Can I charge my dad rent if he comes and moves in with me and I'm taking care of him?
So yeah, at TuckerAllen, when we create caregiver packages to our clients, a lot of times we also include a rental agreement. So if the parent is living in the child's home and the child is taking care of mom or dad, you can actually set up a rental agreement saying, hey, here's the rent that mom and dad pays every month. And then that can be another form of which is a compensated transfer, because they're paying a certain amount in rent for their housing, and that's consideration for those services that the child is providing. So that's another way of spending down.
Yeah, I can imagine that really adds up. If you've got, a full-time caregiver plus a rental agreement, you might be spending, I don't know, 40, 50 grand a year. And that gets them really close to Medicaid a lot faster. Mm-hmm. So what about the tax implications about all this? This is kind of like having a second caretaking job at home, taking care of someone. So
yeah.
Pay taxes on this? How does this work?
So that's actually a really important question to ask in the whole scheme of caregiving agreements, because you do have to get the income that you receive as a caregiver is taxable income. And an important note to this is you would need to have a separate 1099 issued for this income that you're receiving as a caregiver. And the reason why this is so important is that later on, when you apply for Medicaid, MoHealthNet, in Missouri we call it MoHealthNet, they want to see that this is a real income stream that the caregiver is getting. So the separate 1099 will show that.
Okay, so let's work my way through a scenario. We're gonna go with my dad again. I'm sorry, my poor dad, he's fine, but just in case he needs care later on in life, we set up a caregiver agreement. We know that he's gonna need to go on to Medicaid at some point because he just doesn't have the money to pay for long-term care himself. He doesn't have long-term care insurance. So he needs a little bit of help at home with cleaning and cooking and reminding him to take his medication, but he doesn't require me bathing him or cleaning for him, like his actual, like brushing his teeth, all that stuff.
Right.
So as a way to spend down his assets to get him ready for Medicaid earlier, we sign one of these caregiver agreements, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly. And then based on the level of care you're providing him, maybe that'd be like $15, $16 an hour, because you're not doing the full gamut of like cleaning and grooming him, but you're helping him like cook and clean the house.
Okay, so if he has 100 grand of assets that he needs to go through to get on Medicaid, and we set this up and I'm caregiving for him for 2 years at $30,000 a year, we're getting really close to getting him ready for Medicaid, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's a really smart way to do it, especially if your dad is already intending for that sum of money to go to you anyways.
Okay, and then just saying, I set aside that money. I feel bad. I'm going to take care of my dad no matter what, but I set aside that money and I can use it for whatever I want, right? So I could, if I wanted to, take my dad on a nice vacation or something, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's your money, so you can kind of decide how you want to treat your dad if you want to do that. So
okay, so I mean, theoretically, it could be part of my inheritance. I'm just getting it earlier, but it's not.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
What I want with it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a whole lot of sense. You've been really helpful today. I really appreciate you walking us through caregiver agreements because those can be a little confusing as to why people need them.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, as we're wrapping up for the day, I do want to remind you guys again that an attorney-client relationship is not established by watching this Facebook Live program. Just call our office. It's 314-335-1100. And if you want to watch any of our other TuckerAllen webinars and podcasts, you can go to YouTube or visit us on TuckerAllen.com. I think that's all for today.